Hey, Chris.
Are we doing all right?
Very good.
How's
Hello.
it going? Hopefully the microphone on my end lasts forever, but thankfully everyone who's here will be here to listen to you guys. Fingers crossed. The recording of this is going to be live for everyone later on. So if you missed this, you need to leave. Then obviously you can come back and watch the replay later. Charlotte, Deborah, introduce yourselves to the world. Who are you? Where do you work? Tell us what your superpowers are.
Superpowers. Well, I'm Deborah Spurway, and we are part of an organisation called the HR Department, and we provide HR and employment law advice to small to medium-sized employers. And I suppose our superstar bit is trying to keep employers out of trouble and preventing people problems. Chris, you've gone quiet again.
And that's a good thing to do. I think I've worked with you guys for a good while now, and we've worked together as part of the OMG Centre for quite a while as partners as well. You guys work with a few of the agencies that we look after across the country. What's your role in the organisation, Charlotte?
So I work up in the Midlands. I've been here for nearly 4 years, and before that I worked for a very large supermarket chain doing HR for them. So I have a bit of a corporate background.
Would you rather be focusing on the Aldis or the agencies?
Definitely the smallers. It's much nicer working with the SMEs than working for a big corporate, where you're a bit more faceless and nameless.
Very true, very true. So as with every single webinar, any questions, please do pop them in the comments. We're live on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube and Twitter. So if we miss you on the main feed, we'll hopefully catch you elsewhere.
You keep cutting out.
Yep, don't worry about that. We'll keep going. So tell us all about the types of paperwork, guys. What does everyone need in order to keep both the employer and the employee kind of safe, happy, comfortable, and sort of de-risked?
I'm going to kick off here on the basis of keeping us all happy is probably a really good way of saying it, on the basis that employers get very unhappy when their employment documentation isn't fit for purpose. Then they find themselves having to jump through hoops that they didn't know would even be a hindrance to them. So the first thing that we need to have is our employment contract. And our employment contract details statutory rights, it details express clauses, statutory clauses and express clauses. And these things are very important because we must make sure we've got an agreement between the employer and the employee that actually is fit for purpose, on which, more importantly, the employer can make decisions. Then there's more paperwork. Now, due to the GDPR that came in May 2018, gosh, that's dragging back my mind now. Our employers must...
Horrible time for agencies. I'm sure it's awful for you guys.
Yeah. We must have a data protection policy, and more importantly, we must have a privacy notice for our employees. Now, this is important because it's all about how we store data and how we use personal data. So we must inform our employees who may be made aware of their personal data. So this, it's difficult to pay an employee. It has to go to payroll if we don't know their name and address. So having a data privacy notice is important so that we can share data with other people. So if we were giving one to our clients, it would say, I'm going to be sharing your data with our outsourced HR provider. Okay. You must have right to work checks evidence. So nobody really wants to spend £20,000 per employee when the border force come trundling into the office and say this person doesn't have the right to work in the country. and therefore you're going to get a big fine slapped on you, and that's £20,000 a person. So you must be able to provide evidence that the person has got the right to work in the country. This is detailed in their employment contracts, and should that status change, if people are on visas, etc., then obviously people's employment would need to be brought to an end. I think an interesting one there, because we do get quite a lot of visas that last for a particular time, is make that employment contract a fixed term, because it will automatically come to an end when the person's right to work in the country has come to an end.
Sorry to interrupt on that. So with digital agencies, quite a lot of people work remotely. They work across a huge area. So some agencies have got staff in completely...
Yeah, you went quiet. I didn't hear your question.
Far-flung regions of the world. How find employment law works across different jurisdictions? Do you need would the agency in the UK need to make sure that that kind of right to work was applying in the UK if the person still lived in America or something like that?
No, it wouldn't be a right to work in the UK if they were based in America. And this is where people, now we live in this new world of, we can work anywhere. People get a bit confused and think that they're employing somebody in the UK, but they're actually going back to live in Spain. They still want them to work for them. So what the employer needs to think about is more what are the things important in the jurisdiction of Spain, and that will be about the local taxes and everything else that they have to pay.
Okay, so thank you.
Not about.
It's a question that came up with an agency the other day, actually. So I thought I'd throw it in.
I think right to work in any country is probably some reason, but we wouldn't be able to give you the details of those. But I'm sure that we all know you used to have to get a green card to go and work and live in America. So I guess it's the same sort of thing in many countries. What else do we need? We do need to have a disciplinary and grievance policy. This is both helpful to the employer on the basis that, again, they may need to make decisions based on the platform of employment documentation that we've got. Storing data is really important, and I'm flagging this one up because many employers are experiencing employees making data subject access requests. And that means that anything that an employee's name or initials is in, nicknames, they can request that, and that will come from the Information Commissioner's process to actually achieve all of that. So storing data is really important. And one top tip is never write anything down that you wouldn't want to be heard or read in a tribunal. I remember a client once saying in the subject bar, how do you sack an employee? Well, that in a tribunal, if exposed, could say that you'd already predetermined the outcome of a statutory process that may need to take place. So just a word of warning to everybody, even your WhatsApps, even your text messages, if you're business owners and you run it through your own personal phones, it could be that the employee might request access to your personal phones that might have their names in it. So think a little bit about that. We had one recently where two business owners, the solicitor deemed that they had been running their business through their personal phones, so it was intrinsically linked, and they had to provide all the messages relating to that employee on there.
How does that work conversely? If an employee uses their phones to do work-related things, I don't know, freelance work or something like that?
Frightens me to death at the fact that people use their own telephones. I mean, freelancers is a whole different story because we wouldn't be providing them, but it's about employees. So whatever an employee is doing on their personal phone, the employer needs to think about security, what information they're passing backwards and forwards as part of using their, bring your own device to work. Some people have those sort of policies, but they make them quite rigid around it. So an employer can't go to an employee and say, I want to see what you've put on your phone, because they're not a data controller or a data processor for the purpose of the business.
Yeah, I was coming at it
And I'm
more
not
from
a GDPR expert.
yeah, I still don't think there is one. I was coming at it from the perspective that if you're doing something nefarious as an employee, and that would be something that could break your contract with the employer, could the employer's solicitor ask for the data and the phone of the employee? Because it seems like they can for the employer.
No. It really is about the employer being the data controller of information about them personally, but unfortunately not. You'd have to have the text forwarded on from somebody else that felt the person wasn't doing well, and then you might have a bit of evidence that you could use to say that they were breaching the contract.
Fair enough. Another curiosity quelled for me.
We generally recommend a social media policy, and this came about way before GDPR, on the basis that a lot of problems that happen in the workplace and a lot of things we come up against is grievances that relate one employee to another because of things that they've put on their social media that might link to the employee, or they've done silly things. A query yesterday is one of my colleagues asking, how can we stop employees of a business that actually does a lot of work with high profile celebrities from taking photos of them and then posting them on their social media? If you work in particular industry types, it's important that you have control as a business on somebody else using what could be deemed confidential information about your business, what you're doing, and they're posting it on their own social media. So often I would recommend to people, it's quite a good policy to have, i.e. it will say in it, and you can't just post what you like about the company in some sort of words.
And if you work with a partner like yourselves, is that are those kind of boilerplate things that you can help, and then they can be nuanced by the business individually? Is that something that I'm guessing the answer is very clearly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's why Charlotte and I chatted through yesterday. You know, what are the minimum platform of employment documentation you need? I mean, you could go into rafts of policies. I mean, we as a country, we haven't just had a pandemic and Brexit. We've got new social movements. We've got mental health and well-being. We've got menopause sitting up there. There are so many employment bills being discussed at the moment. You know, employers don't know what to do first, because they go, Christ, I've done that. Oh, I haven't done that. And do I need to do it? So it's about having enough employment documentation to be able to make those decisions and act upon them, rather than perhaps working in the NHS and just having reams and reams of policies that aren't particularly required if you're sensible.
So, Charlotte, if you've got all of these documents, let's say you do one now, then another month, another month. Is it better to just do them all in one go? Because there's stuff here that you're mentioning that I've not thought of ever, and I'm sure I didn't have that policy when we were running the agency. May well have done, but probably didn't. It might well be a newish thing or something like that. How do you stop it becoming less impactful, since you're having to keep adding more?
Yeah. So I would always say, so with employment contracts, a little known fact, because they snuck it in literally during the pandemic, is you should if you've got anyone working for you, your employee should have a contract on or before their first day. So it used to be you had like a month to get round to getting it done. Nowadays, you need to get that contract, needs to be day one or before. With the other stuff that Deborah mentioned earlier, it's ideally you'd want it ready for when people are working for you, because you want to set up your stall of, this is, if things go wrong, this is what we are going to do. If things go wrong for you, this is what you can expect from us. Added to the employment contract, it always makes employees feel more part of an organization if they kind of know where they stand. You'd be surprised the number of people who don't feel secure in their job because they don't have a contract. You're like, oh, but I've known them for ages, it's fine. but actually having that black and white really does make people feel better. The same with stuff like, you know, getting the privacy notice, getting the data protection stuff. That's kind of, ideally want that done early on, because again, you need to have that information for the employees. But other things, for example, I know Deborah mentioned like a mental health policy. Those are things, do not panic if you don't have them day one. They're definitely stuff that you can roll out kind of as your business grows, or as, you know, you take on more people, or, you know, if you're a one-man band, do not be worrying if you don't have your own mental health policy. You know, nobody, if you went to a tribunal, there's 2 of you working there, no one's going to expect you to have a rigid mental health policy, for example. But they are definitely stuff that in HR department that we do day in, day out for our clients. You know, that quite often I'll get a call and say, we kind of want to do something, what can we do? And then we would always do something really bespoke. So like we talked about the social media policy, you know, if you're going to be working with celebrities, you're going to want it far more rigid than if you're a factory making parts for a car. You know, you're very unlikely to meet any celebrities in that situation. But Facebook, Twitter, Instagram kind of get, you know, Snapchat get a lot of people into a lot of trouble.
And I guess when you work with an agency or with any small business, it's kind of where you guys come in, a bit like when I asked about superpower. It's a pretty big superpower to be able to kind of diagnose what you need more readily than maybe something else, because maybe you're a tiny agency of 5 staff, but 4 of them are in different parts of the country and you're working really sensitive data. You need something very much more focused than 3 people working together in a small office just down the road and they're all, you know, friends or married or something.
Yeah, definitely. And this is why we always recommend straight off the bat is having that disciplinary and grievance policy. It's one of those, it's a bit like car insurance. You need it, but you don't want to use it. Because actually, if something does go wrong, even with friends, family, you know, relations, if things go wrong, it's nice to have something in black and white that you can stand behind and say, this is the process we're going to follow and we're going to do things properly.
Yeah. And we did a webinar a couple of months ago with the insurance firm Riskbox, and what they were talking about was employer liability insurance, professional indemnity insurance, and things like that. And part and parcel of getting the employer liability insurance, obviously you're not going to have a very good insurance policy if you haven't got any employment contracts that are up to date and things like that. So these 2 things go quite readily hand in hand, it seems.
Yeah, and actually that's a nice thing to point out with insurances and stuff is, you know, you've got to kind of, without scaring everybody listening in and watching, is that, you know, you've got a risk whenever you are interacting with the public and kind of putting out job adverts and starting to look at employing people, that anyone can make a claim at tribunal based on a protected characteristic. So, you know, we're seeing it more and more as, you know, the climate changes. Go on.
I'm going to put my hand up and say, can you tell people, including me, what a protected characteristic is?
Yeah, so there are 9 areas and they cover anything from gender, from sex discrimination, from disability. There's a whole raft of things. I won't bore you with the full list, but basically, you know, race, all those sorts of things come as a protected characteristic. If somebody feels that they are being discriminated against and treated, you know, less favourably than others because of one of those characteristics, they can still go to tribunal, even if you didn't employ them. So, you know, if they feel that, you know, your job adverts is for, you know, the example I always use is for a barman. You know, if you have a pub or a bar, you're looking for a bar person, ideally, rather than a barman, because that would exclude people of non-binary, that would exclude females, and, you know, it's becoming more and more common for people to try and take stuff to tribunal, even if you didn't interview them. So it's just when you're getting all your paperwork in check, it's just a thing to have in the back of your mind is, you know, treat everybody favourably. If you're not sure, ask the question. We had a client recently who turned down somebody for a job because the girl was in a wheelchair and all of their toilet facilities and break room was upstairs. But what they didn't do was ask her if she was, you know, used the wheelchair full time or if she was able to get out of the wheelchair. So they said no to her for the job. Turns out she only needed it, during the day to kind of go A to B, but actually she had limited mobility and could have used the stairs to use the toilets. But they'd made that assumption without even asking her the question. So that's one that you may well see in tribunal, because we made a guess and it did not pay off. So,
I mean, the assumption being the mother of all mess ups, should we say?
Yeah,
so
it's just when you're doing the paperwork, it's just another thing to consider, really, just to keep you safe.
What other things do we need if we were to look at like the whole shopping list, Deborah? I know that we probably got about halfway through your shopping list before we went off on a tangent.
No, I think you pretty much got it. So just in summary, an employment contract, a privacy notice, a data protection policy, a disciplinary and grievance policy. You must do your right to work checks. And we recommend a social media policy. That's a good platform of documentation for a small employer. That will give you the ability to make decisions and use documentation under which processes can be followed. So you think that's your compliance level, really. That's your compliance level. That's a very good entry point, and then go on to think, do I want to give benefits? Do I want to have some additional policies? So that's really your compliance level.
So question that I think a lot of agency people will probably ask at some point, either in their head or out loud, hopefully out loud to someone who's a professional. Most agencies start as a one-man band all by themselves in most cases. When you hire your first member of staff, usually you just download a boilerplate contract and away you go. Eventually you have several staff, but all of them have a version of a different contract. And eventually you go, I need to be professional. I need to speak to someone. How do you normally tackle that kind of 4 people on 4 different versions of more or less the same contract, but not the right one?
I mean, we do a lot of free reviews of employment contracts for clients to see what they've actually got and is it still fit for purpose. I think the most important thing is don't reinvent the wheel when it's there. Charlotte was talking about new legislation that just slipped in April 2020 when we all had bigger fish to fry with the pandemic. And that was the largest, called the Good Work Plan, the largest piece of employment legislation that had taken place for many, many years. So 2 years down the line, when we're reviewing employment contracts for clients, there were certain clauses that had to be added into contract types. So they're updating those. However, they didn't need to have them in the contract clauses for the existing employees, but they needed to be aware of, what's coming up for new employees. So if you're doing a review of 3 or 4 different contract types, I mean, I've done this when, I've worked for clients in, Smithfield Market, and they've come, they're 50 years old, some of these contracts. But really what you're trying to do is make sure it's got the minimum amount it needs. Generally, when people want to change a contract, it's because they either want to change some terms, that they want to look at how they redo their hours. People may be asking now, contract says you work in London Wall 5 days a week, 9 to 5:30, but actually now you work 2 days a week at home. So it's, those sort of things can be dealt with through a contract amendment letter instead of creating a whole new one for employees, because then you have to go into consultation so that, Jack, John, Bill and Amy's contracts all look the same, when actually it might not be required. Okay,
so I think that probably allays some concerns that I think a lot of agencies will have. But it does sound like a review is a sensible thing to do anyway, because there's probably some gremlins in there from a downloaded boilerplate contract that happens to have US jurisdictional information in or something like that because you Googled it.
And there's no harm in, if you get a nice shiny new contract template of issuing new contracts to people, you just got to make sure we're not changing their terms. So if somebody used to have 25 days of holiday, making sure you haven't suddenly just given them 20 by mistake. But having everybody on the same type of or same style of contract, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah. So we've talked about what we need. We know we need lots of contracts and various different things in contracts and stuff like that. I'm guessing some of these policies can be wrapped into like a handbook or something like that, or
yeah, I mean, people can
reference to a handbook.
They can, we're moving forward in the world of technology here. So most people, keep them on a drive that people can access. Some people have HR information systems so that employees can book their holidays, reference their sickness, keep all their pay details. And employers can keep other things on such platforms such as appraisal notes, one-to-one notes, etc. So I think it's more. Sorry,
no. I was thinking, you've got all these contracts in place, you've got all the things, the paperwork bit, but there's stuff which we all know, a bit like the assumption around the wheelchair thing, that you've got an obligation to do or not to do certain things. So, as an employer, what are like some of the key kind of obligations that you need to be aware of that might not be just in the black and white of a contract?
I suppose this looks at, your obligation. Charlotte already said you've got to have your employment contract by day one. Now, we had the auto-enrollment pension. The pension pots got smaller. The government forced us as employers to pay into our employees' pension. They have the right to opt out of it, but they must be reminded every 3 years that they can opt back in. So pensions are a really important one. You'd be surprised how many small businesses are still out there and they haven't sorted out their pensions. We're not pensions experts, but we do work with some experts who managed to stop a number of fines. Pay is very important. That you have a big obligation about that and how you're recording it in real-time information. And you must be abiding with the national minimum wage. This changes April the 6th every year. And we must be aware of what those rates are changing to, particularly if we, say to somebody, I need you to work more hours, but I'm just, paying the same amount of money. They could be deemed that they're working more hours and they're actually then getting less than the national minimum wage for the hours that they're working. Now, in reality, people get paid a salary and they tend to work the number of hours it takes to do the job in many types of industry types. But I think the important thing there is to be absolutely certain that you meet the national minimum wage, especially if you're just starting an agency. And, money's tight, but we want to take that next step and we want to bring somebody on. Family leave's very important, big obligation. I mean, we've got all sorts now. It used to be you go on maternity leave. Now we've got adoption leave. Now we've got shared parental leave, so they can share it between the child's parents. Then we've got paternity leave. Then we've got parental leave. So there is a huge amount. But if we stopped anybody from taking that or took any decisions against that person to their detriment because they asked for it, it's a big obligation. We must provide the family leave. What else is important to us? We have to work in a safe working environment. So could be some health and safety involved in that, because a contract of employment will say you are responsible for your own health and safety and we are responsible for your health and safety. But we're also the other important thing about safety, and you get this a lot now when people allege to bullying or harassment in the workplace, and that is about people use the words, I don't feel safe here anymore. That's where employers sometimes find the person might choose to resign and claim a constructive unfair dismissal. So I always say this to clients, have you got a grumble or have you got a grievance? So all of those, if people are muttering words to you and you really don't know where to go, pick up the phone and ask an expert what you should be thinking about. And my best piece of advice I ever learned from a top employment law solicitor was the words, employment law is a game and he who has the best audit trail will win. So we document things. And that's not an obligation, but it will be very helpful to any employer when perhaps relationships break down, performance isn't good, or conduct isn't good.
I was going to say in digital agencies, there's an awful lot of ambiguity in the delivery of some of the services and what there is no black and white in exactly the perfect way to deliver things, and sometimes that can break down relationships. Equally, a lot of agency owner founders are not great leaders, and there's management of people problems around those sorts of things. And I think to your advice there, I think having really good quality processes with people around looking after them, making sure they've got the right contracts is the basics, but keeping an eye out for all of their statute, your obligations to them, and managing things like one-to-ones properly and consistently done and things like that. An audit trail, just in case, makes a hell of a to do.
Yeah, what I would always advise, especially if you've got a lot of people working remotely, is, if you've had to have a difficult conversation with them, or you've had a conversation where you've given them very, rigid instructions, is follow it up with an email. As per our conversation, type it out. It's an audit trail. Like Deborah said, whoever's got the strongest audit trail wins. And, having this stuff in writing, especially if you have lots of conversations or lots of quick phone calls or text messages, just a summary via email, because it date stamps itself. You can't argue with it if it's in black and white. So it's really helpful, especially if you're not working in the same room as the other person and you're giving them instructions and they're not following them. As per our conversation, we talked about XYZ. Please, can you make sure you do action by this date? Really simple, really straightforward. There's no arguing with it.
Yeah, and this brings on to a question that I've just seen from Twitter rather than through the feed here. Just popped it up on the bottom of the screen there. It all appears to be employee focused. They get their own way. Is that right? So obviously, audit trail, they might not get their own way because you've got a really good audit trail. But it does seem that the obligations are on the employer to do a lot, and it seems like you have to capitulate a lot as a boss. Is that what do you think about that, you guys?
I think that's that would just bring me back to saying you have your platform of documentation. It's very hard to turn, somebody who's very creative at times into being a people manager, because we're trying to run our own business. This is what we do well, and that's why you're talking about. We've got creatives, and some people might end up squabbling because they want it, delivered in a certain way.
And they do.
But it really is about, so the good practice is inducting our employees. Let's talk a bit about the culture of our business. Let's do our one-to-ones. Let's be supportive. Let's show that we've done those things, because then basically we're trying to help those employees, move forward in the business.
And he's right. There are some statutory obligations that, when you employ people, you will need to follow. But there are, without sounding very callous, there are ways and means. If somebody's not right for your business, there are ways of managing, ways of dealing with them. So long as you're sticking within the legal parameters, you're not completely, your hands aren't completely tied, but you need to do things the correct way.
It's almost like you knew what was coming, Charlotte, because what are statutory rights that we all need to know? And we talked about things like holiday and things like that, but if it were that simple, then this one webinar would be enough for everyone. And there's a whole reason why you guys do such a good job and exist as an organisation. So what kind of statutory rights do employers have, employees have, and are there any wiggle around any of those things, and not in a wiggle to get out of them, but any kind of grey areas in some of those?
So the ones you're going to come across the most if you employ one person or 50 people or 500 people is sick pay and holidays. So everyone has a right from day one to statutory sick pay. That's in, I can't remember the exact figure at the moment, which shows how much of a professional I am, but it's around £100 a week. So, you're not, I realise to a small business, it's a lot of money, but again, it's been put in place, unions have fought long and hard because, back not even that long ago, some employees would have got absolutely nothing. So although it feels sometimes like a big hit, especially if you feel like the person is maybe not being as genuine about being off sick, you do have to pay them, unfortunately, even if you don't believe that they're off sick genuinely. What you don't want is to have to fight a tribunal proving that they had a cold or not when you should have been paying them. The other one that's going to be a bit tricky maybe for this webinar today is holidays, and what part-time people get and what people who work term times get. There's a whole, please talk to a professional about working out holidays. If they're just getting the basics, there is a great calculator on the government website that does go in, if you've just got basic holiday questions, that will steer you in the right direction. But in essence, everyone who's an employee is entitled to holiday, whether that's a proportion of it or a full amount of it. I don't want to go in too much into the nitty gritty of holiday because we could do a whole webinar on how you work it out. But
maybe we will.
In essence, this is what it is. It's going to be 2 hours of me talking about holiday. But in essence, if you're paying them, they're on payroll, they're an employee, they will be entitled to holidays of some sort. That is a statutory right. You need to give them rest time away from the business. Whether they're going abroad or not is not your concern. It's time away from the business. Those are two big ones that you're going to get day in, day out with your employees. Other rights come into play. So the things like that Deborah mentioned, like pensions, their right to have their contract of employment, to be able to see their terms and conditions, their right to raise things like a grievance. There's a lot of stuff that keeps coming through the woodwork now, things like whistleblowing, where people are raising concerns. So, if somebody's raising an issue to you, you've got an obligation to listen to them.
Yeah, it's totally.
Yeah.
But knowing how agencies work, there's an awful lot of times where it can feel like it's a very small thing or a very small match fire in the grand scheme of all the other fires that you're putting out throughout the day. So would it be a reasonable thing to, if you everyone's got a lot going on, and there's obviously a reason to take note of all of these things, because when people are concerned, it's really important to make sure they're treated well. How would you log it? What would you advise if I'm super busy and I know I've got to log something which could be an audit trail thing in the future, but it seems less important than the 3 other things that are on the other pile? So
I would always use the email system again, because again, nice audit trail. Acknowledge that somebody's raised something, and then say, I really want to talk to you about this. I want to give it the proper time. Please, can we meet on X date? Don't leave stuff too long. But it's not unreasonable if somebody emails me now for me to say, can we talk about it Monday, Tuesday, because I've got more time to give to you. What I will advise.
Sorry.
No, what all I was going to say is, we always hope that stuff will go away and kind of quiet down, and it never does. It goes away and it grows arms and legs and it becomes a horrible monster to deal with. So it's fine to say, I haven't got time right this second to deal with it, but I'd always advise, if it's important enough that somebody has raised it to you, give it a little bit of time, even if it's at the end of the day, even if it's in a week's time, because when you're employing people, they want to be seen, heard and recognised. It's really important. And it may not feel big to you, but if somebody's raised it, it will probably feel big to them.
And I guess the thing that you, like you said, you mentioned email as part of an audit trail quite a few times, because it's obviously really important. But agencies love Slack and they love Teams. It's not the right place to log these things, is it?
It's a great way to communicate, but it's, again, kind of going back to that first slide that we talked about. If you get a data subject access request, your Teams or Slack messages can also be looked at. So if you're putting anything negative in there, just be careful. But I always like an email because it's a nice, clear line of communication. It timestamps it for you. You can easily find it. You can easily store it. If you are, like I said, if you're working remotely and you're not in the same building as people, it's great to acknowledge stuff on Teams or Slack and say, we can have that conversation. But if you want to properly document it, I would just follow up with, hey, I've made us here's a Teams invite. We'll have this meeting on Monday and we'll talk about it properly. There's no harm in that. And I'm lazy, so it's much easier for me to send an email and then Outlook will look after it forever for me, as opposed to me being like, oh, I've got to save that.
It's a safe pair of hands.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
So-
very unlikely to lose all of my emails, whereas finding one Teams message in a raft of other Teams messages, because it hasn't got the best search function, is always going to be a pain in the bum. So
Absolutely. And to sort of wrap things up a little bit, because I know we could be here for hours because there is a lot. And from experience of speaking with agencies and with your good selves, I know that there's a huge amount to this. It's not just as easy as a 40 minutes conversation. But Deborah, what would you say would be, besides picking up the phone and working with you guys, what would be your one piece of advice that every agency leader watching this between now and whenever YouTube stops existing, what would you advise them to do right now?
Get the compliance level right. So, you know, we insure our cars, we insure our houses, our contents. These things are important to us. So if we're not meeting the compliance level for being an employer, we need to think about that quite quickly.
Awesome. And I totally agree. It makes a hell of a lot of sense. The interesting thing is, and maybe you guys do something like this in lots of software companies, when you're signing up and when you're going through a process, you've got the checklist of all the bits you've done as you're going through.
Yeah.
It feels like there should be something for employers where it's like, you've got the contract sorted, you've got this, you've got like an onboarding, like, I don't know what I don't know. And there's so many different places. You guys know just as well as we do, navigating the government website is a rabbit warren of different places to go. So it would be cool if there was like a checklist system that would help doors businesses. Maybe that's something we should talk about.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's
a good idea.
it's always something we can do and make bespoke, because unfortunately there isn't an easy one size fits all, because everyone's business is going to be different. You know, if you're an agency employing one new person, going to be the amount of due diligence you need to do is going to be vastly different to if you're a school employing 50 teachers, for example. So I'm afraid there isn't a nice, quick, easy form that I can give to you, but it's definitely something we make for bespoke for our clients, because they are going to have different needs and wants. So.
And that makes it a hell of a lot more of a good tie-in to booking a call in with you guys. Charlotte, what would your one piece of advice be to take away? What should everyone do right now once they've done what Deborah said?
Mine would be just communicate with your people. So many problems come from either thinking you've been clear and you haven't, or doing something and not telling your employees before. You know, there's not every business decision, but you know, if it's going to involve them, it's going to be important to them. Just talking to them. The amount of conversations I have where I go, "Oh, have you talked to that person?" They go, "No, not yet." I'm like, maybe talk to your people then. You know, so many things could be fixed with a good bit of clear communication.
There's a lot of head in the sand activity that goes on when these are things that are very important, but also they're things you don't understand very well. So my last bit of advice from tying both those two things together is, if you don't understand it, seek to learn it, but don't seek to be an expert, and speak to experts to help you. You shouldn't be trying to be an expert, because that's probably going to get you in more trouble than it's worth. So it makes a hell of a lot of sense to get your compliance levels up and also speak to your team like human beings and deal with the problems that come in the ways that you're obliged to, but as human beings, the ways that you should probably treat each other as well. Yeah,
your employees will be far more, in most cases, far more understanding if you've come at it from a human, compassionate point of view and then done the compliant legal bit behind it. Whereas if you try and just make the best of it without involving them, they're normally not as understanding, because then they Google their legal rights and start demanding those.
Deborah, Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on to the webinar today. I know you're already saving lives. I'm glad you're saving the lives of so many agency owners already. But everyone who's watching this,
saving their bank balance is what we do.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.